Let's get started. Story number 1.
When we decided to move to the small town of Greendale, we thought it would be the perfect escape. It had everything we were looking for: quiet, picturesque, and a lot cheaper than the city. My husband Mark had landed a remote job that allowed him to work from anywhere, and I was finishing up my degree online. It felt like the ideal time for a fresh start. Greendale was a place you wouldn't even notice unless you were looking for it. It wasn't on the way to anywhere. It was just a small dot on the map, nestled between hills and forests. The town itself was mostly old homes, a small downtown area with a diner and a few shops, and a few more houses scattered in the countryside. We'd driven through it a couple of times when we were looking for a place to buy, and though it felt old-fashioned, it had a charm to it that made me feel at ease. The people there were polite but distant, as if they'd been living in the same patterns for decades and didn't particularly care for newcomers, but they weren't rude. It felt like a town that hadn't changed in years, untouched by modern life. We found a house on the outskirts of town, a 2-story Victorian-style home that had been built in the 1800s. It had a large yard, a faded wooden fence, and a stone walkway that led to the porch. The house was old, but it had character. Wooden floors, stained glass windows, a grand staircase, and a fireplace in almost every room. It was everything we were looking for, and when we saw the price, it seemed like an unbelievable deal. I remember the real estate agent, Sarah, seemed in such a hurry to get us to close on the house. She didn't spend much time telling us about its history, other than mentioning it was an older property and that it had been vacant for the past few years. When I asked if anything strange had happened in the house, she just smiled and said, "Not that I know of. It's a quiet place." She didn't elaborate. The first few days in the house were blissfully peaceful. We unpacked, set up the furniture, and took walks around the town to get familiar with the area. The neighbors were few and far between, but they were friendly enough, offering a wave or a brief hello when we saw them. There was an old man named Albert who lived next door, and he'd wave at us from his front porch while we tended to our garden. He was always quiet, a man of few words, but he had this way about him, this sort of knowing look in his eyes when he watched us. It was almost as though he had seen something we hadn't. The house, while beautiful, had an eerie stillness to it. It was almost too quiet. I often found myself straining to hear sounds, only to be met with silence. Mark never seemed to notice the odd atmosphere, but I did. It was as if the house had a pulse, a presence that lingered in the corners and in the shadows. It wasn't until the first night we spent there that I started to realize something wasn't quite right. That night, we were settling in for bed when we heard the noise. It was faint, like a tapping sound, coming from the floor above. I looked at Mark, who seemed unbothered. "It's probably just the house settling," he said, rolling over to go to sleep. But it wasn't the house settling. The tapping grew louder, closer, and then it turned into footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking around upstairs. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps continued for a while and then stopped. Mark didn't stir, his breathing steady and deep, but I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was walking through the house, someone who didn't belong. The next morning, I went upstairs to check. The whole second floor was empty, just as it had been when we moved in. The rooms were tidy, the floors clean, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Mark laughed it off when I told him, "You're just stressed from the move. You'll get used to it." I tried to brush it off, but it didn't stop. The footsteps continued. Every night. Sometimes they were louder, sometimes softer, but always there. And it wasn't just the footsteps. I'd hear doors creaking open, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I asked Albert one day if he had ever noticed anything strange in the house, and he gave me a long, hard look. "Old houses have their secrets," he said cryptically. "Some secrets are better left undisturbed." His words stayed with me, and over time I started to feel the house pressing in on me. It wasn't just the noises anymore. It was the feeling of being watched, of something moving just beyond my sight. It was like there were eyes everywhere, peering from the corners, lurking in the dark spaces between rooms. I started avoiding certain areas of the house, like the attic and the cellar, but it wasn't long before the feeling crept into every room. Mark didn't seem to notice any of this. He went about his day as usual, working from his desk in the study, oblivious to the growing tension I felt. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if the house was actually changing. But then one evening, everything changed. It was a cold, rainy night when it started. The wind howled outside, and the trees shook in the storm. Mark was in the study, and I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The sound of the rain against the windows was loud, and for a moment I thought I heard someone crying. It was faint, almost like a whimpering sound, but it was coming from somewhere upstairs. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way upstairs. The house creaked underfoot, the floorboards groaning in protest. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening. The crying sound was coming from the farthest room on the left, the master bedroom. I slowly pushed open the door. The room was empty. But then I saw it, a figure standing by the window. A woman, her back to me, her long hair hanging down over her shoulders. She was wearing an old-fashioned nightgown, stained and torn at the edges. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but the air around her felt thick, suffocating. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. It was like my body was frozen in place. And then, as if she sensed my presence, she slowly turned to face me. Her face was pale, gaunt, and her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to draw me in. I felt myself taking a step forward, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. She opened her mouth, and for a brief moment, I thought she was going to speak. But no words came out. Instead, a cold gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me, and the lights flickered. When I turned around to look back at her, she was gone. I bolted from the room, running down the stairs and into the living room, where Mark was still sitting at his desk. I was panting, my heart racing, and he looked at me with concern. "What's wrong?" I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words felt like they were stuck in my throat. He didn't believe me. He couldn't. I sounded crazy. But I wasn't crazy. I knew what I had seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, sitting on the couch, staring at the dark hallway. I heard the crying again, faint but distinct. It was coming from upstairs, but this time it wasn't just the woman. There were other voices, whispers, low and unintelligible, like a chorus of shadows. And then I heard footsteps, steady, measured steps, walking across the floor above me. I knew I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Something was wrong with it, but it wasn't just the house, it was the town. It was as though the entire place was trapped in a cycle, haunted by the past, by something that refused to let go. The next morning, I tried to pack, but Mark wouldn't hear of it. He said I was overreacting and said it was all in my head. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't live in a house where the walls whispered, where the shadows moved, and where someone was always watching. I left without telling him, leaving the house behind. I haven't been back to Greendale since. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the crying. And I know that the woman in the nightgown is still there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I moved to Arundel on a whim, really. I'd never even heard of the place before a friend mentioned it in passing, but I was looking for something different, something to clear my head after the mess that was my life. The city had drained me. The constant noise, the constant rush, the anonymity. I didn't want to be anonymous anymore. I wanted quiet, peace, a place where no one knew my name. Arundel was exactly that. It was small, isolated, a sleepy little town tucked away in the hills. The houses were old, each with its own history, and the streets were lined with tall trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. The town didn't have much of a modern presence, no flashy stores or chain restaurants. Instead, it was full of local shops, a few family-run businesses, and a town hall that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. I found a small cottage on the outskirts, a little further from the town center than I'd anticipated, but it had an undeniable charm. The rent was shockingly low for such a place, and when I asked the landlord about it, he just shrugged and told me it had been vacant for a while. "It's a quiet place," he'd said. "A bit older than most, but it'll serve you fine. Might take some getting used to, though." I thought nothing of it at the time. Old houses, creaky floors, strange noises. I figured it was just the usual small-town charm. After all, I was used to the hum of the city, the constant buzz of life around me. A little quiet wouldn't hurt. The first night was peaceful enough. I settled in, unpacked my things, and set up the place. The house was cozy, with wood paneling that made it feel like a cabin. The air smelled of pine, and the creaks of the floorboards seemed almost comforting, like the house was alive in its own way. I sat on the porch that evening, the sky painted in shades of purple and orange, and watched the town fade into the horizon. As the sun went down, something about the stillness of the night gave me pause. The air had an odd weight to it, heavy but not unpleasant. I couldn't put my finger on it. I told myself I was just adjusting to the new surroundings, and with that thought, I went inside, locked the door, and went to bed. The second night, things took a turn. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound that I couldn't ignore. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping, but it grew louder the longer I lay there, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The sound was coming from the wall near the foot of my bed. Tap, tap, tap. It was so rhythmic, so deliberate, that I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I thought it might be a tree branch scraping against the wall, but when I got up to check, I saw nothing through the window. I stood there staring at the empty yard outside, my breath fogging up the glass. The wind had picked up, but there were no branches near the wall, just an open space. Still, the tapping continued. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling, the foundation shifting in the night, but the sound wasn't like that. This was different. It was too deliberate, too conscious. The next few days were strange, but I dismissed it. The tapping stopped after that night, and everything seemed normal. I went into town and explored, met a few locals, had a drink at the only bar in town, and tried to get settled. Everyone was friendly, though there was an odd quality to their friendliness. It was almost as if they were just a little too polite, a little too careful around me. One woman in particular, Marla, who worked at the bakery, made a point to tell me about the history of Arundel. "You know," she said one morning, as she handed me a warm loaf of bread, "this town has its share of stories. Some of them you might not want to hear, but then again, you might be interested. The town's older than it looks." I smiled, taking the bread from her. "I'm sure there are plenty of stories in a place like this." Marla smiled back, but there was something behind her eyes, something guarded. "You'd be surprised. It's not all the good kind of stories either, especially not about the old places." She didn't say much more after that, but I could sense that she knew more than she was letting on. I didn't press her, though. I wasn't exactly there for ghost stories. That night, after the conversation with Marla, I couldn't shake the unease that had begun to settle in the pit of my stomach. I found myself jumping at every little noise, especially when the sun went down. The tapping came back again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just coming from the wall. It was coming from the floor, too. Soft, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth across the room beneath me. I could feel the floorboards tremble as if something heavy was walking through the house. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 3 a.m., the hour I'd woken up before. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and for the first time, I truly questioned whether I was alone in the house. I waited. The footsteps continued for what seemed like hours. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The house went silent. Too silent. I don't know how long I lay there just listening, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I finally fell back asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, I went into town again. I couldn't keep the feeling of being watched out of my mind. It was as though something had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. I didn't mention the noises to anyone, but I kept thinking about what Marla had said. The old places, the stories. The town had its share of dark ones, it seemed. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk up the hill behind my house. The weather was crisp, the air cool and refreshing. As I reached the top, I stopped to take in the view. The town spread out below me, peaceful, idyllic. But then something caught my eye. On the far side of the hill, near the tree line, I saw something that made my stomach twist, a figure standing still, watching me. I stared at it for a few moments, my heart pounding. But when I blinked, it was gone. I turned around and walked back down the hill, my pace quickening, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to entertain. That night, the footsteps returned, but this time they were accompanied by something else. I heard whispers, faint, barely audible voices that seemed to be coming from the walls. I tried to make out what they were saying, but the words were garbled, unintelligible. I stood up, my hands trembling, and walked slowly toward the door. But as soon as I reached the hallway, the whispers stopped, replaced by a sharp, loud knock from the back door. I froze. It wasn't like any knock I'd ever heard. It was hard, like someone was banging with something heavy. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to see who or what was at the door. But my curiosity got the better of me. I moved to the door slowly and peered out through the small window beside it. Nothing. The yard was empty. I stood there for a moment, staring out into the darkness. Then I closed the door and locked it, double-checking the deadbolt. I backed away slowly, my mind spinning. The next day, I found out more about the house. I ran into Henry, one of the locals I'd met at the bar, and I asked him about the history of the place. He looked at me for a long time, then leaned in close. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "You need to get out of there. There's something in that house, something that's been there long before you. People have lived there and left, but none of them stayed. It's always been the same. You hear the tapping, the footsteps, that's it trying to make contact." "Make contact with what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Henry shook his head. "Something you don't want to find out. Trust me." I didn't need to hear more. I knew what he meant. I knew what he was trying to warn me about. The house was more than just old. It was haunted, and whatever was in there didn't want me to leave. I packed up my things the next morning, too afraid to stay any longer. As I left the house, I glanced back one last time. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, but also something else, something darker. A feeling that whatever had been waiting for me in that house wasn't finished with me yet. I never returned to Arundel. The town, the house, they remained behind, like a chapter in my life that I tried to forget. But I still hear the tapping sometimes, even now when the wind blows just right. Story the end.
Story number 3.
When I moved to Verondale, I was looking for peace. After years of dealing with the bustle of city life, I wanted a fresh start in a quieter, slower place. Verondale, a town of just under 1,000 people, seemed like the perfect place to settle. Its streets were lined with old trees, and its buildings had a historic charm. The people I met were friendly, though a little reserved, and it wasn't long before I started to think of it as home. I rented an old Victorian house on Maple Street, just on the outskirts of town. The place was large, with creaking floors and a staircase that groaned when you walked up it. It had been vacant for a while, and the realtor assured me it was in good condition. The walls were adorned with wallpaper from a bygone era, and the furniture in the rooms, though old, had been cleaned and arranged to give the place a sense of character. It felt like it was full of stories, though I soon learned some of those stories were better left untold. I settled in quickly. The town was small enough that I could get to know most people within the first few weeks. There was a little diner, a few local shops, and a library where I spent a lot of my afternoons. But it wasn't just the town that fascinated me. It was the house. There was something about it that I couldn't shake. I would catch glimpses of strange shadows out of the corner of my eye, and sometimes, at night, I would hear faint sounds coming from upstairs as though someone was walking around in the dark. At first, I assumed it was the house settling. Old houses make noises, I told myself, but it didn't take long before I started to feel that there was more to it. The footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic, to be mere creaks in the floorboards. They were followed by whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking I was just tired from the move, or perhaps just letting my imagination run wild, but the noises didn't stop. They became more frequent. One night, I was sitting in my living room, reading, when I heard a loud crash from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up immediately, moving toward the staircase. I was about to call out, but stopped myself. There was no way anyone else could be in the house. I was alone. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way up the stairs. The light from the beam flickered as I stepped onto the second floor, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw what had caused the noise. The old portrait of a woman that had been hanging on the wall at the end of the hall was now lying face down on the floor. The frame cracked. I picked it up and examined it. The woman in the painting had an unsettling look in her eyes, dark, intense, almost as if she were staring right at you. I couldn't help but feel like she was following me, her gaze never leaving me, even as I set the portrait back up on the wall. I was about to return to my room when I noticed something odd. The door to the room at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it earlier. Curiosity overtook me, and I slowly approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was empty, save for a large antique mirror hanging on the wall. I stepped inside, drawn to the mirror. As I approached it, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection. Just a flicker, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I whipped around, but there was no one behind me. The room was still. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone in the house, that someone or something was there with me, lurking just out of sight. I tried to brush it off, but the anxiety built up, knotting itself deep in my stomach. I returned to my room, locking the door behind me and pulling the covers over my head. But sleep wouldn't come. The next day, I went to the town library. I had to know more about the house, its history, its past. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Fletcher, was an older lady with silver hair and a stern expression. When I asked her if she knew anything about the house on Maple Street, she hesitated, her eyes darting toward the back of the library. "Why do you want to know about that house?" she asked, her voice low. "I just moved in," I replied. "I was hoping to learn more about it." Mrs. Fletcher seemed to consider my words carefully before speaking again. "That house has a history," she said, her tone ominous. "It was built back in the 1800s by a man named Henry Barlow. He was a wealthy landowner who had a reputation for being cruel. He ran the town with an iron fist, and there were rumors that he mistreated his workers. The house was said to be a place of great wealth and luxury, but it was also a place of dark secrets." "Dark secrets?" I asked, intrigued. "Some say that Henry Barlow's wife, Margaret, was never seen after they moved in. Others say she died under mysterious circumstances. No one really knows what happened to her, but there are whispers of strange happenings in that house ever since." I felt a chill run down my spine. The woman in the portrait, Margaret, perhaps? Could it be her presence that I was feeling? The stories from Mrs. Fletcher were unsettling, but they only confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Something wasn't right with the house. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen table, trying to process everything I had learned. I could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, as if someone was speaking just out of range of my hearing. I got up to investigate, but found nothing. It was then that I noticed the door to the cellar was slightly ajar. I hadn't been down to the cellar yet. The house was old, and I was hesitant to explore too much, especially after the strange noises I had heard. But something urged me forward, a strange compulsion I couldn't explain. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly descended the wooden stairs, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The cellar was damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and mildew. There were shelves lined with old jars and dusty bottles, and in the far corner, an old wooden chest sat beneath a thick layer of dust. My heart raced as I approached it, my fingers trembling as I reached for the latch. When I opened the chest, I was met with a burst of stale air. Inside, there were old clothes, some yellowed with age, and a stack of papers tied together with string. I untied the string and sifted through the papers, most of which were illegible. But one letter caught my eye. It was dated from the 1920s and addressed to a Miss Margaret Barlow. I began to read. "My dearest Margaret, I fear that you have been wronged, that the house you call home has become a prison. There are those among us who wish to see you suffer. I know you have felt the shadows closing in, but I must implore you to leave. This house is no longer safe. The walls themselves are closing in, and you are not the first to suffer its curse. Please, before it is too late, leave. Leave and never return. Yours always, a friend." The letter sent a wave of dread through me. I set it down quickly and looked around as though the shadows themselves were closing in around me. That was when I heard it, the faintest whisper. It was clear now, a voice calling my name. I turned to look, but there was nothing. I rushed back upstairs, the weight of the letter heavy in my hands. I couldn't stay there anymore. The house was alive, and it had been waiting for me to uncover its secrets. The whispers had become louder, the footsteps now constant and growing closer. I packed a bag that night and left the house. I didn't care where I went, just as long as I got away. As I drove away from Verondale, I glanced back one last time, my heart heavy with the realization that the house was still there, watching me. The following week, I learned from Mrs. Fletcher that the house had been sold again. But I couldn't help but wonder, who would move in next? And what would happen when the house began to call their name? Story the end.
Story number 4.
When I first moved to the small town of Eldridge, I didn't know what to expect. It was a place that hardly appeared on any maps unless you were specifically looking for it. A quiet town tucked away in the mountains, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. The population was small, under 1,000 people, and the streets were lined with trees that created a canopy over the roads. The town had an eerie charm, like it was frozen in time, like a place where nothing had changed for decades. I wasn't looking for a new home, but after a series of life events that left me emotionally exhausted, I found myself searching for peace. I needed a fresh start, a quiet place to clear my head. Eldridge seemed like the perfect choice. The real estate agent who helped me find a small house on the edge of town was friendly, though she was oddly hesitant when I asked about the house's history. "It's an old place," she said, glancing over her shoulder as though the house itself might be listening. "But it's solid. No problems that I'm aware of. The previous owners, well, they left quite suddenly." That should have been a red flag, but I was too eager to escape my old life to worry much about the details. The house was an old 2-story Victorian with creaky wooden floors and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. The moment I walked inside, I felt a strange mix of calm and unease. It was a perfect fixer-upper, dusty but full of character. The walls had a faded elegance, and the rooms were spacious. The furniture was sparse and dated, as if it had been abandoned for years. Still, I could see the potential. I wasn't planning on staying forever, but it seemed like the ideal place for the time being. I spent the first few days settling in, unpacking my boxes, and cleaning the house. The neighbors were polite, but they kept their distance. I couldn't help but notice that no one came by to visit. There were plenty of families in the neighborhood, but there was something off about the way they looked at me. It wasn't exactly unfriendly, but it wasn't welcoming either. I shrugged it off as small-town isolation, the kind of thing you'd expect in a place this quiet. As the days passed, I began to feel a sense of discomfort in the house. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a feeling. The air seemed heavier at night, the house colder than it should have been, even with the heat running. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and sometimes, when I would be sitting alone in the living room, I'd hear a soft noise from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sounds were different, too deliberate. Footsteps, not just random creaks, but the unmistakable sound of someone walking across the floor. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a loud bang from upstairs, followed by what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, frozen. The noise was coming from the bedroom above. Slowly, I stood up, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling again. I cautiously climbed the stairs, my pulse racing. The room at the top of the stairs was empty, no sign of anything that could have caused the noise. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, and as I walked closer, I could feel an unusual coldness in the air. I pushed the door open fully, but nothing was out of place. The bed was neatly made, the window shut. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the only sound was the faint hum of the house. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. Objects would shift slightly, as though they had been moved while I wasn't looking. A glass of water would be knocked over, though there was no explanation for it. I found myself double-checking that all the windows and doors were locked, even though I hadn't been outside. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard a soft whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I listened closer, I realized it was coming from inside the house. "Get out!" The words were barely audible, but they were unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, but when I turned on the light, the room was empty. I pulled the covers around me, trying to calm myself down. It was just my imagination, I told myself, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The whispers grew louder over the next few nights. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to be getting more insistent. Leave this place. Get out. Each time I would sit up, my eyes darting around the room, but there was never anyone there. The coldness in the air became more pronounced, as though the house was alive with a presence that I couldn't understand. It wasn't just at night. I started noticing strange things during the day as well. Sometimes when I'd walk through the hallway, I'd feel something brush against my shoulder. A light touch, but there was no one there. Other times the lights would flicker and the air would grow thick as though I was being watched. I finally decided to visit the town library to see if I could learn anything about the house's history. Clara, the librarian, was a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She seemed kind, but when I asked her about the house, she grew tense. "Ah, you've moved into the old Hathaway place, haven't you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yes, that's the one. Do you know anything about the previous owners?" Clara hesitated for a moment, then sighed. The Hathaway family, well, they weren't exactly a picture of happiness. They were reclusive, kept to themselves mostly. But there was something strange about them. The husband, Robert, had a reputation in town. He was a quiet man, but there were rumors that his wife, Eleanor, went mad. Some say she was haunted by something in the house. Others say she was just sick. But after she passed, Robert left town suddenly. No one knows what happened to him. The house was left abandoned for years. I was starting to get the sense that I wasn't the first person to feel uncomfortable in the house. So what happened to the house after they left? Clara's face grew pale. The house has been sold and resold several times over the years, but no one ever stays for long. People say it's cursed. There's talk of strange occurrences, of voices in the walls, things moving on their own. Some people say it's Eleanor's spirit. Others think it's Robert's. No one really knows, but the house has a history of driving people away. I left the library feeling more unsettled than ever. The next few days were a blur of strange noises, cold spots, and feeling watched. I tried to ignore it, but every night the whispers grew louder. The presence in the house seemed to intensify until it felt like I wasn't living alone anymore. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to leave. I packed my things and went to the car, but as I tried to start the engine, it sputtered and died. I turned the key again, but nothing happened. It was as if something didn't want me to leave. My hands were shaking as I got out of the car and turned to look at the house one last time. The lights in the windows flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing in the upstairs window. I ran. I never went back to that house. I left Eldridge soon after, never looking back. But every once in a while, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear the whispers. And I wonder if the house is still waiting for its next victim. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I never thought much about ghosts before I moved to the town of Gray Hollow. I had always considered myself a rational person, someone who believed in science and logic, not in the supernatural. But that all changed the moment I arrived in Gray Hollow. It was a small, quiet town that didn't even appear on most maps. Surrounded by thick woods and foggy hills, Gray Hollow felt isolated from the rest of the world. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were viewed with suspicion. But I had my reasons for moving there. My life had fallen apart in the city. Job loss, a broken relationship, and the death of a close friend. I thought I could start over in a place where no one knew me, a place where I could find some peace. I found a small cottage on the edge of town, nestled against the woods. It was an old house, over a century old, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The previous tenant had left abruptly, and the landlord was eager to get it off his hands. I didn't mind. I liked the idea of a quiet, solitary place to live. I didn't ask too many questions about the house, and I didn't want to know much about its past. I just needed a roof over my head. At first, everything seemed normal. The house was cold, especially at night, but I didn't mind. I'd always preferred the chill. The town was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I would wander through the streets trying to get a feel for the place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The people in Grey Hollow were friendly enough, but there was a strange distance in their eyes, as though they were all hiding something. One evening, as I was settling in after a long day of unpacking, I heard something outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rustling the branches of the trees, but the sound persisted, a soft scratching like nails against wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was too deliberate, too precise to be the wind. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But something in my gut told me it wasn't. I chalked it up to the isolation, the eerie quiet of the town. I was just getting used to the place, I told myself. It was probably nothing. But the next night it happened again. This time I was more prepared. I sat up in bed, listening intently, waiting for the sound. And sure enough, it came, soft scratching, just like before. But this time I was sure I saw something moving outside the window. A shadow, tall and thin, moving quickly between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the window, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The next morning, I decided to take a walk through the woods. I needed to clear my head and shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The woods were dense, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. I walked for hours, trying to find some peace, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was as if the trees themselves were staring at me, waiting for something. As I walked deeper into the forest, I stumbled across a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a stone well, overgrown with vines and moss. It looked ancient, and something about it felt wrong. The air around the well was thick, heavy with an oppressive energy. I approached it cautiously, my mind racing with questions. What was this well doing here? Why hadn't anyone mentioned it? I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness below. But before I could make out anything, I heard something behind me, a low, guttural growl. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The forest was silent, too silent. No birds, no animals, just the sound of my own breath. I backed away from the well, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I made my way back to the path. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things. Scratching sounds, low whispers, footsteps in the hallway. Every time I tried to close my eyes, it felt like something was lurking just outside the edge of my vision. I would snap awake, heart pounding, but there was never anything there. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, and the air felt cold, too cold for a house with the heat turned up. The next few days were a blur. I was exhausted, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I avoided the woods, but the strange occurrences didn't stop. The scratching outside the window became more frequent, and sometimes I could hear soft whispers just out of reach, as though someone was standing right behind me. But when I turned, no one was there. It wasn't until I met an elderly woman named Evelyn that I started to understand what was happening. She was one of the few people in Grey Hollow who wasn't afraid to speak to me. She lived in a small house near the edge of town, and I would often stop by to chat with her when I needed some company. One afternoon, after a long conversation about the town's history, I decided to ask her about the house I was renting. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before answering, her eyes growing distant. "You're staying at the old Cartwright place, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, I didn't know much about it when I moved in." "Why?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "That house has a history, you know. There were rumors about the Cartwrights. Strange things happened there, things no one ever spoke about. They say the house is cursed." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head, her face paling. "Some things are better left unsaid, dear. You should leave that house. It's not a place for anyone to live." I tried to press her for more details, but she clammed up, her eyes filled with fear. I left her house that day, feeling unsettled, her cryptic warnings echoing in my mind. The next night, I decided to do some research on the Cartwright family. I went to the local library, which was small but well kept. The librarian, a middle-aged woman named Margaret, seemed to know exactly what I was looking for when I asked about the Cartwrights. She didn't say much, but she handed me a few old newspapers from the 1920s. The articles were filled with vague references to fires, strange disappearances, and mysterious deaths. One article in particular caught my attention. It was about a fire that had burned down the Cartwright estate, killing the entire family. But there was something off about the article. The date was strange, and the details didn't quite match up with what I had been told. I stayed up late that night, piecing together the articles, trying to make sense of the information. The more I read, the more I became convinced that there was something deeply wrong with the house. The fire that had killed the Cartwrights wasn't an accident. It was something far worse, something dark that had been lurking for years. The next night, I went back to the clearing in the woods, hoping to find some answers. I stood in front of the well, my heart pounding in my chest as the wind began to pick up. I felt a cold chill in the air, and I heard the familiar growl from behind me. This time I didn't turn around. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to let whatever was following me control me anymore. I approached the well, my hands shaking as I reached down to touch the stone, and then I felt it, a sharp tug at the back of my mind, a whisper so faint I almost didn't hear it. You shouldn't have come. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, and the trees around me began to twist and bend, their limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. The growl grew louder, closer. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the wet earth as I stumbled back toward the path. The whisper followed me, growing louder with each step. You shouldn't have come. I didn't stop running until I was back at the house, slamming the door behind me. The house was silent, but I knew it wasn't over. The presence was still there, waiting for me, just out of reach. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The scratching, the whispers, the growls, they all became a part of the house, and I knew that no matter what I did, I would never escape them. I stayed in Gray Hollow for another week, but the house never let me rest. The presence grew stronger each day, until I couldn't tell where the house ended and the haunting began. I left the town the following week, never to return. But even now, I still hear the whispers, the scratching, the growls. They follow me, no matter where I go, and I know that Gray Hollow will always be a part of me. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I moved to the small town of Hillsbrook in the fall of 2022, seeking an escape from my chaotic life in the city. I was burnt out, tired of the noise, the crowded streets, the endless work hours that left me feeling disconnected from everything that used to matter. A quiet, small-town life seemed like the perfect antidote. Hillsbrook was a place I'd only heard about in passing, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, far enough from the nearest city to offer peace, but close enough to have occasional visitors. The house I found was an old two-story colonial at the edge of town. The listing didn't say much, only that it was priced to sell quickly due to a recent family situation. The realtor didn't give me much information either, but it was cheap. Too cheap to ignore. I figured it was a fixer-upper, a place I could make my own. The kind of house I could walk away from the noise and the rush of the world and just breathe for a while. The first time I saw it, I wasn't sure what to make of it. The house was situated on a large plot of land with a thick grove of trees stretching behind it. From the outside, it looked like a normal, if somewhat dated, house. A large porch, old windows, and a tall, narrow chimney. There was a rusted swing in the front yard, covered in ivy. The paint was peeling, and the lawn hadn't been tended to in what looked like years. But there was something about it, a strange, unexplainable pull that made me feel like it could be home. The moment I stepped through the front door, I felt an odd chill, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The interior was more or less what I expected. Old hardwood floors, faded wallpaper, a creaky staircase leading up to the second floor. The air smelled musty, the kind of smell you get from a place that's been empty for far too long. But the place had potential. I signed the papers and moved in a week later, eager to start this new chapter. The first few days were peaceful, almost idyllic. I spent time cleaning, unpacking, and getting a feel for the space. The house had its quirks. The floors were uneven in places, some of the windows stuck, and there was a certain heaviness to the air in the evenings, but it didn't bother me. It was the kind of place where you could relax and enjoy a cup of tea while watching the trees sway in the breeze. At least, that was what I kept telling myself. Then, one night, things changed. It was a Thursday evening. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a deep shade of purple. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard the sound of footsteps. I thought maybe it was the house settling. Old houses make strange noises. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking up the stairs. I listened carefully, but the house was silent again. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to my book. But the sound came again, louder this time. Step, pause, step. It was coming from upstairs. My heart began to race. I stood up, feeling a strange unease wash over me. I had been the only one in the house since I moved in, and the idea of someone or something upstairs was unsettling. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the stairs, the beam cutting through the darkness of the hallway. At the top of the stairs, the air felt heavier, colder. I could see a shadow moving in the dim light. Someone was standing in the hallway, just out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, listening. The shadow shifted again, and then I heard a soft whisper, like a voice carried by the wind. Come closer. I didn't know what to do. I was rooted to the spot, my body tense with fear. The whisper came again, closer this time, almost a breath against my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the light flickering faintly above me. I didn't go back upstairs that night. I spent the rest of the evening in the living room, the shadows from the trees stretching long across the yard as the wind picked up outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. It was as though something, or someone, was watching me, waiting. The next day, I met a few of the neighbors. I didn't want to mention anything about the strange occurrences in the house, but one woman, Mrs. Green, asked me how I was settling in. Everything all right in that old house? She asked, her voice low and careful. I wasn't sure how to respond. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't ignore what had happened. It's fine, I said. Just a little creaky, Old house. She nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something that made me uncomfortable. Yeah, those old houses have a way of settling in, don't they? But you should be careful in that one. There's a history there. What do you mean? I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was listening. That house belonged to the Carringtons. Lovely family by all accounts, but something happened to them. A few years ago, they all just up and left. No one really knows why. Some say they saw things, others say they heard voices. It's not a place you should be in alone for too long. I laughed, trying to play it off. You're not serious, are you? Mrs. Green didn't laugh. Just be careful, she said before walking away. I didn't think much of it at the time. Old towns, old stories. It was probably just superstition. But that night, the footsteps came again. This time, they were louder, more insistent. I couldn't ignore them. I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the stairs once again. The air was colder than before, the house eerily silent except for the soft shuffling of footsteps above me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. The hallway light was on, but it was dim, as if flickering from somewhere deep inside. I stepped forward, heart hammering in my chest, and I saw it, just at the end of the hallway, a figure, pale and translucent, standing at the edge of the guest room door. It was a woman, or what appeared to be a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair dark and tangled, her face obscured by shadows, her head tilted slightly as though she was waiting for me to approach. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air felt thick, suffocating. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a step toward me, and I ran. I bolted down the stairs, heart racing, but when I reached the bottom, I heard a voice, soft and breathy, coming from behind me. Leave. I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed my things and fled the house, driving aimlessly through the town, not sure where to go. I pulled over near the old cemetery, my hands shaking as I tried to calm down. That's when I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The cemetery had a grave for the Carrington family, and the dates on their tombstones were recent. Too recent. When I returned to the house, it was silent. The footsteps were gone. The figure was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. Something in that house had called to me, and now it would never let me go. I stayed in the house for another week, but I never felt safe. Every night the whispers would return. The footsteps, the figure always watching. It felt like the house itself was alive, feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each passing day. I left Hillsbrook shortly after, and to this day I haven't returned. The house still stands, empty and waiting, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can hear the faintest whisper in my ear. Come back. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I moved to Gray Hollow in the fall after my divorce. I didn't know anyone there, but the town felt small enough to disappear into. I needed a change, a place where the memories wouldn't follow me at every turn, and I found that in Gray Hollow. Nestled between the mountains and a dense forest, the town was as isolated as it was charming. It was one of those places you could miss if you weren't looking for it, a blink and you miss it kind of town, with cobblestone streets, a town square that seemed stuck in time, and old homes with that lived-in look. Everyone was polite, though distant, and the townspeople had a tendency to watch you without saying much. I found a house on a quiet street just beyond the heart of the town. It was a 2-story brick house, clearly old, with ivy crawling up its sides. The lawn was unkempt, and the windows were streaked with dust. But it had potential, and it was cheap, so cheap that I didn't even ask why. The realtor was a tall woman with pale skin and hollow eyes. When she showed me around, she kept glancing at her watch, as if she couldn't wait to be done. She spoke quickly, listing off the features of the house, but I could sense she was eager to leave. Don't mind the noise at night, she said with an uneasy laugh when I asked about the area. It's just the house settling. These old places always do that. The town's quiet, though. No trouble. She handed me the keys, and without another word, she left. At first, everything felt fine. The house was bigger than I needed, but the space felt comforting. I spent the first few days unpacking and getting used to the creaky floors and the smell of old wood that seemed to linger no matter how many candles I lit. There were no other houses immediately nearby, just trees and the occasional farm, giving me a sense of seclusion I hadn't realized I needed. But then the noises started. It was subtle at first, a creak here, a tap there, the kind of sounds you attribute to the house settling. But they became more frequent, and soon they weren't just confined to the floorboards. At night, I'd hear something like footsteps walking up and down the stairs. Soft, slow, as though someone was pacing the halls. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was just imagining things. I'd spent the whole day unpacking and was tired, so I shrugged it off. But when it happened again and again, I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just footsteps either. There were soft knocks on the walls as though someone was tapping out a rhythm, deliberate, methodical. I mentioned it to a few of the neighbors when I ran into them on a trip to the grocery store. They all smiled in that polite, unsettling way, but no one seemed willing to engage. One man, an older fellow with thick glasses and a hunched back, leaned in closer as though sharing a secret. Some houses here don't like new people, he said in a low voice, his breath smelling faintly of tobacco. You'll get used to it. It's just the way things are. His cryptic comment didn't sit well with me, but I tried to brush it off. The first real incident happened 2 weeks after I'd moved in. It was late, around 2 a.m., and I was in bed, trying to sleep through the persistent creaking sounds. But then something changed. I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my door. Not the soft, random creaks I'd grown used to, but distinct, slow steps. Someone was walking toward my room. I sat up, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the house shifting. But as I listened, I realized there was something else, something off. The footsteps didn't have the rhythm of a person's walk. It was irregular, almost like something dragging behind them. I got out of bed, my feet heavy against the wooden floor, and crept toward the door. I held my breath as I pressed my ear to the wood. The steps stopped. I waited, too afraid to open the door, unsure if I should look or if I was better off pretending I hadn't heard anything at all. But then came a soft whisper, a voice that seemed to float just on the other side of the door. Help me. I backed away, stumbling over the edge of my bed, and fell to the floor. The whisper echoed in my mind, the words repeating themselves like a chant. I had no idea what to do. Was someone outside my door? Had someone broken into the house? But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Nothing but silence, and the house seemed stiller than usual. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following days were marked by an eerie sense of unease that hung over the house like a fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even when the house was quiet, I felt watched. The sound of footsteps continued every night, always just outside my door, always at 2 a.m., though I couldn't bring myself to open the door again. I would lie there, frozen, listening to the dragging steps that would come and go. It was then that I noticed the photographs. There was a hallway upstairs that led to the master bedroom, and on the wall was a collection of old black and white photographs, mostly portraits of people I didn't recognize. But one photograph stood out. It was a family portrait, father, mother, and a young girl, no more than 6 or 7. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and though their faces were mostly expressionless, there was something haunting about the way the little girl was looking at the camera. Her eyes seemed to follow me, no matter where I stood. One night, after hearing the footsteps, I decided to do some digging. I went to the local library to see if I could find anything about the house's history. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Fenton, barely acknowledged me when I asked for help, but when I mentioned the house, she stiffened. "Not many people ask about that house," she said, her voice clipped. "You sure you want to know?" I nodded. She hesitated, then pulled out an old binder from a shelf and handed it to me. The binder was filled with newspaper clippings, all about the family who had once lived in my house. The parents, Charles and Edith, had disappeared nearly 60 years ago. The Clara had been reported missing a few days before them. The police suspected the parents had taken Clara and left the town, but no one had ever found them. The case had gone cold, and eventually the town moved on. But what caught my attention were the details that weren't in the public record. According to a local legend, the family hadn't left voluntarily. Some said Charles had gone mad, that he had become obsessed with something in the house, something he couldn't escape. Others claimed that Clara had been the one to suffer most. But there were no solid answers. I couldn't shake the thought of the photograph, the way the little girl's eyes seemed to follow me. That night, the footsteps came again, but this time they were accompanied by a soft, slow tapping, like nails on wood. I didn't know what to do anymore. I tried everything. I prayed. I tried to ignore it. I even contacted a local priest to bless the house, but nothing worked. The sounds grew louder, more frequent, and the whispers became unbearable. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I packed my things, my heart heavy, knowing that I couldn't stay another night in that house. But when I tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. I tried again and again, pushing and pulling, but the door remained locked. Panic set in. I rushed to every window, but they were sealed shut. The house was trapping me inside. I heard the footsteps again, now right behind me, moving through the house like a storm, and then came the whisper, clear and loud, "Help me." I turned, and there she was, Clara, standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale and ghostly, her eyes wide and full of fear. She didn't speak, she didn't move, but I could feel the desperation in her stare. I ran. I don't know how, but I managed to get out of the house through a window that opened just enough to squeeze through. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The next day I called the authorities. When they arrived, the house was quiet. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anything unusual, but they found the same photograph I had seen, framed, hung on the wall. They also found a new one, me, standing in the hallway, frozen in fear. No one could explain how it got there. I left Gray Hollow soon after, and the house was put back on the market, but I've heard rumors about the house, about the family, and sometimes when I dream, I see Clara's eyes staring at me from the darkness. Story the end.
Story number 8.
We moved to the small town of Briarwood on a whim, searching for a change of pace. It wasn't a decision we took lightly, but the promise of quieter streets, less stress, and a new beginning seemed too perfect to pass up. Briarwood was the kind of town you could drive right through without noticing. It was tucked in a valley, surrounded by woods, with old brick buildings and a few hundred residents who mostly kept to themselves. The town seemed frozen in time, as though nothing had changed in decades. Mark, my husband, had been working from home for the past few years, and with me finishing up my freelance work, we decided it was time to leave the hustle and bustle of the city. After a few weekends of house hunting, we found an old Victorian house on the outskirts of Briarwood, at the edge of the woods. It was a bargain, almost too good to be true, given its size and condition. The house was large and grand, with a crumbling stone walkway that led up to an arched wooden door. It had old stained glass windows and high ceilings with crown molding. Though it needed a little work, it felt like it was meant for us. The realtor, a woman named Evelyn, was enthusiastic but oddly rushed. She showed us around quickly, barely touching on the history of the house, only mentioning it had been vacant for several years. When I asked her about the previous owners, she just said they'd moved away, leaving the house in need of repair. There was something unsettling about the way she avoided looking at me when I asked if anything strange had happened in the house, but she smiled and assured us there was nothing to worry about. We didn't give it much thought at the time, but looking back, I wish we had. The first few weeks in Briarwood were exactly what we had imagined. We settled in, unpacked, and explored the quiet little town. People in town were friendly, but there was a distant air about them, as if they were waiting for something. The neighbors kept to themselves, exchanging only brief hellos when we saw them outside. We met a few folks at the local diner, but conversations were always short and ended abruptly. No one seemed eager to make new friends. There was a strange tension in the air that I couldn't quite put my finger on. We kept ourselves busy. I started working from home, and Mark spent his days in his office, while we both enjoyed the peace and quiet of the area. The house, though old and somewhat dark, felt like a haven. The air inside was thick with dust, but there was something comforting about the silence that enveloped us. It was like we could breathe easier here, away from the noise and chaos of the city. But that silence wasn't always peaceful. It started with the sound of footsteps. At first, it was faint, just the sound of someone walking upstairs. Mark and I would exchange glances, but we never spoke about it. I chalked it up to the house settling, the creaking old floorboards shifting in the night, but it didn't stop. Every night, without fail, we would hear the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth in the hallway above us. Sometimes it sounded like they were moving toward the stairs, but when we went to check, there was no one there. Mark still didn't seem bothered by it, but the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up every time the sound started. It wasn't normal. I started to feel uneasy in the house, a sense of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a feeling in the corners of my mind, but it grew stronger with each passing day. I tried to ignore it, but it became harder to dismiss the strange occurrences. Lights flickered at odd times. Doors that had been closed would be open when I returned to a room. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to unsettle me. And then, one evening, I heard something I couldn't ignore. It was late, and Mark was in his office working on a project. I had just finished cleaning up the kitchen and was heading upstairs to bed when I heard it. It was soft at first, a muffled whispering coming from the top of the stairs. I paused, thinking it was just the wind. But then it came again, more distinct this time, a voice. A woman's voice, though I couldn't make out the words. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering stopped suddenly, and then, from the silence, came the sound of the footsteps. Closer this time, almost at the top of the stairs. I waited for Mark to come out of his office, but the house was eerily still. I wasn't sure if I should go up there, but something pushed me to move forward. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. The house was silent now, too silent. I slowly walked to the end of the hall, where the master bedroom was. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the floor. As I pushed the door open, the temperature in the room dropped. It was freezing, and I could see my breath mist in the air. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively stepped back. There was something wrong with the room. I turned the light on, but the cold didn't dissipate. As I stood in the doorway, I saw a faint figure, almost like a shadow, moving across the far wall. It wasn't clear, not exactly a person, but it was there, shifting in the corner of my eye. I couldn't bring myself to go inside the room. I just stood there, watching, frozen in place, until the shadow disappeared. I backed away quickly, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to wake Mark, but I didn't want to seem irrational. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of the move had gotten to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day I asked around town, trying to get a sense of the place's history. I spoke to a woman at the local coffee shop, someone who had lived in Briarwood her entire life. Her name was Emma, and she was in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back into a neat bun. She smiled warmly when I introduced myself, but when I mentioned the house, her expression changed. "You live in the old Miller place, don't you?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. I nodded, not sure where this was going. "Be careful there," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might overhear. "It's been vacant for years, but the Millers, well, they didn't leave on their own. They had to get out." She paused for a moment, and I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. "People say it's haunted." I tried to laugh it off, thinking she was just spooked by small-town rumors. But Emma wasn't done. She told me about the Millers, a family who had lived in the house for decades. They had moved there in the early 1900s, and from what Emma could remember, the family had been well-liked, though they were never very social. The youngest daughter, Eleanor Miller, had been the subject of many whispers around town. Emma didn't know the full story, but she told me Eleanor had disappeared under strange circumstances. After that, the house was never the same. The family left not long after, and the house was empty for years before we moved in. When I asked Emma what had happened to Eleanor, she just shook her head. "No one really knows. It's just people think let's just say some things are better left undisturbed." I didn't know what to make of it all. I had to tell Mark, but when I did, he shrugged it off. "It's just small-town gossip. People talk, nothing more." But I knew deep down that something wasn't right in that house. The footsteps, the whispers, the cold spots, it all pointed to something that wasn't just in my head. The night that changed everything, I woke up to the sound of someone crying. It was soft at first, like a faint sobbing, but it grew louder and more desperate. I tried to wake Mark, but he was fast asleep, oblivious to the sound. The crying seemed to come from everywhere. Around me, inside the walls, beneath the floorboards. I could feel it in my bones. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and walked through the house, trying to trace the sound. It led me upstairs again to the master bedroom. The door was open, just like before. The room was icy cold, and the air felt thick with something dark. I stepped inside, my heart racing, and that's when I saw her. A woman, standing in front of the window, staring out at the woods. She wore a long, tattered gown, her hair long and unkempt. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then, in a voice that wasn't her own, she whispered, "Leave this place. It's not for you." I turned and fled. I didn't look back. We left Briarwood the next day. We never spoke of the house again. I couldn't bring myself to. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear the crying, and I can still see her standing there in the shadows, waiting. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
We moved to the small town of Westbrook at the tail end of winter. My wife, Sarah, had found a charming little house for sale. The town, with its tree-lined streets and quiet atmosphere, seemed like the perfect place to raise our young daughter, Emma. We were tired of the chaos of the city and hoped to find peace in the countryside, away from the noise and traffic, surrounded by nature. The house was an old colonial-style building located just on the edge of town, nestled in the woods. It was 2 stories tall, with large windows that looked out over a thick expanse of forest. The walls were covered in ivy, and the front porch creaked under the weight of its age. It had a timeless charm that drew us in the moment we laid eyes on it. The realtor, a kind woman named Laura, had been quick to tell us that the house had been abandoned for years, but the previous owners had left it in decent condition. There were a few repairs needed, but nothing we couldn't handle. When we first arrived, we were enchanted by the quaint town. Westbrook was quiet, even for a small town, with only a handful of businesses scattered along the main street. The people were polite but distant, often nodding as we walked by, but rarely stopping to chat. It felt like a place where everyone knew everyone else, but newcomers were treated with a quiet, curious distance. We didn't mind. We were looking for solitude, after all. The first few nights in the house were peaceful. We unpacked boxes, set up furniture, and started adjusting to our new routine. The house, despite its age, had a warmth to it. The floors creaked with every step, and the air smelled faintly of wood and earth, but it felt like home. Emma loved her new room, and Sarah was already planning out the garden she'd tend to come spring. But there was something about the house that unsettled me. I couldn't quite place it at first. It wasn't anything overt, no crashing sounds, no ominous presence. It was more like a feeling that lingered in the corners of the rooms, something I couldn't quite see but could feel out of the corner of my eye. A tension that never quite went away. Sarah, of course, dismissed it as stress from the move, and I did my best to ignore it as well. I had no reason to believe there was anything sinister about the house. That all changed one night about 3 weeks after we'd moved in. It was a cold, moonless evening in late February. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and causing the branches to scrape against the house like long, bony fingers. Emma had gone to bed early, as she usually did, and Sarah and I were enjoying a quiet evening in front of the fireplace. I was sitting in my armchair, reading a book, while Sarah scrolled through her phone, occasionally glancing up at me. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Then I heard it. It started as a soft tapping, barely audible over the howling wind outside. It was coming from upstairs, from one of the bedrooms. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. The old timbers and the wind often played tricks on the ears, causing things to creak and groan, but the tapping persisted. It was rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on the wall. Then it stopped abruptly. I set my book down, furrowing my brow. "Did you hear that?" I asked Sarah. She looked up from her phone, clearly not having noticed. "Hear what?" I hesitated. "It sounded like someone tapping, like on the wall." Sarah shrugged. "Probably just the wind or the house settling. You're overthinking it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stood up and walked to the foot of the stairs. The house was eerily quiet now, the tapping gone. But I couldn't ignore the sense of unease that had settled over me. Something felt different. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps soft on the wooden floors. The silence was suffocating as I reached the top of the stairs, and I stood there for a moment, listening. There was nothing, no sound at all. I slowly walked down the hallway toward Emma's room, but the door was closed, just as it always was at night. The air in the hallway felt colder than usual, and I shivered, despite the warmth from the fireplace downstairs. I reached out and opened Emma's door. Nothing was out of place. Emma was lying peacefully in her bed, curled up under the covers, but the room felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy. I felt as though something was watching me. I looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of my discomfort, but nothing seemed amiss. The tapping sound, the chill in the air, everything was just wrong. I closed the door gently and went back downstairs, trying to shake the feeling. I didn't want to wake Sarah up to tell her, knowing she would probably just brush it off. Still, the unease remained. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the tapping sound. I mentioned it to Sarah over breakfast, but she wasn't concerned. "You're just tired," she said, offering me a sympathetic smile. "You've been working a lot." I couldn't argue with that. I had been feeling increasingly exhausted, likely from the move and the adjustment to our new life in Westbrook. But something still gnawed at me, a persistent feeling that I couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, the tapping grew more frequent. It wasn't always the same time, but it would happen almost every night. Sometimes it would start softly, like a distant knock, but other times it would be louder, almost like someone was banging on the walls. I tried to dismiss it as the house settling, but it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. It felt purposeful. I decided to do some digging on the house's history. There was an old library in town, and I figured I could find some answers there. Maybe there had been previous owners who had reported strange occurrences. Maybe there was an explanation. I spent an entire afternoon at the library, going through old records and town archives. It wasn't long before I came across a name that made my stomach drop: the Morrow family. They had lived in our house decades ago in the 1920s. The records indicated that they had lived there for several years before suddenly leaving in the middle of the night. No one in town seemed to know exactly why they had left so abruptly, but rumors persisted. One rumor stood out to me. It was said that the Morrow family had experienced strange events in the house. People had claimed to hear strange noises at night, footsteps where there were none, voices echoing through the halls. But the most unsettling story was the disappearance of one of the Morrow children, a young girl named Eleanor. She had vanished without a trace, and despite extensive searches, she was never found. The story sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that the tapping, the whispers, and the coldness I had been feeling were all connected to this past. But I couldn't explain why. What did it mean? And why was it happening now? That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever it was that was haunting the house. I had no idea what I was expecting, whether I was hoping for some sort of logical explanation or some kind of closure, but I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. I stayed up after Sarah and Emma went to bed, sitting in the darkened living room, waiting. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The wind outside had died down, and the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually I heard it. The tapping, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It sounded like it was coming from the upstairs hallway, just as it always had. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly made my way upstairs, determined to find the source of the noise. I reached the top of the stairs, and this time there was no cold air. There was no sense of unease. The house felt still. I walked toward Emma's room again, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I opened the door, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. In the corner of the room stood a figure. It was tall, gaunt, with long, tangled hair that hung like a veil over its face. It was staring at me, unmoving, as though it had been waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. My body went numb, and for a moment I thought I might faint. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the figure as it slowly raised its hand and pointed at the bed. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo through my very bones, it whispered, "Leave this place." I didn't think. I turned and ran. We left the house the next day. I never went back to Westbrook, and I never told Sarah the full story. We moved to a different town, far from the memories of that house. But sometimes, when the wind is right, I can still hear the tapping, and I can still see the figure standing in the corner, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I moved to a new town, hoping for a fresh start, a place where I could escape the burdens of my past. The decision to leave everything behind and start anew seemed logical at the time. I was tired of the chaos of the city, tired of the noise, the people, the endless rush. I needed peace, something calm and simple. A small town tucked away in the countryside seemed like the perfect place to rebuild my life. The town I chose was called Grayford. It was small, barely more than a speck on the map, and I didn't know much about it, other than the fact that it was quiet. When I arrived, I could feel the weight of the silence, the way it hung in the air like a heavy mist. There were no towering buildings, no neon lights, no bustle of cars or pedestrians, just wide, empty streets lined with modest homes and fields that stretched out toward the horizon. It was a place where time seemed to move slower. I found a house on the edge of town, an old two-story that looked like it had been around for generations. It was affordable, almost too affordable, and had a certain charm that drew me in. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Evans, was polite but distant. He didn't say much about the house, other than it was available and ready for rent. I didn't ask questions. I was eager to settle in and put the past behind me. The house itself had a worn, weathered look. The floors creaked with every step I took, and the walls seemed to sigh when the wind blew. It was the kind of house that had a history, stories hidden beneath its wooden beams, lingering in the corners of every room. It felt lived in, but not in a comforting way. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me, but I told myself it was just my imagination. It was an old house, after all. The first few days were quiet. The town was peaceful, and I spent my time unpacking, getting to know the area. The people were friendly, though they kept their distance. I didn't mind. I was content with the solitude, content to let life unfold at its own pace. But as the days passed, I began to notice strange things happening in the house. At first, it was subtle. A door that would creak open when I was sure I had closed it. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one else was there. little things that could be explained away by the house settling or the wind. But the longer I stayed, the more these occurrences seemed to grow in intensity. It started with the lights. At night, when I would settle into bed, the lights in the living room would flicker on and off. At first, I assumed it was a wiring issue, but the flickering seemed to have a pattern, as if someone were deliberately turning them on and off. It happened at the same time every night, just as I was about to fall asleep. I would get up, annoyed but not frightened, and turn the lights off again. But when I returned to bed, the flickering would start again. Then came the tapping. It began as a soft rhythmic sound, like someone lightly tapping on a wooden surface. It would start at random times, when I was in the kitchen, when I was sitting in the living room, even when I was in bed. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from the walls, other times from the ceiling. When I would get up to investigate, the tapping would stop, only to start again when I returned to my spot. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was rats in the walls or the pipes making noise, but something about it didn't feel right. There was an odd quality to the sound, like it wasn't just random tapping. It felt deliberate, purposeful. The turning point came one night when I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone whispering. It was faint, just a murmur at first, but as I listened, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like a conversation, two voices speaking in hushed tones. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, but the voices were muffled, as though they were coming from the other side of the walls. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and moved toward the hallway. As I walked, the whispers stopped. I stood in the hallway, listening, but everything was silent. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, but the feeling of being watched lingered, and sleep wouldn't come easily. The next morning, I decided to visit the town's small library. I was hoping to find some answers about the house, perhaps some history or local legends. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Barnes, greeted me with a kind smile. "Looking for something in particular?" she asked. "I'm new to town," I explained. "Just wanted to learn a bit about the place, maybe about the history of some of the older houses." She paused for a moment, her smile fading slightly. "Well, there are a few old stories about Greyford," she said quietly. "Some of them are best left untouched." "Untouched?" I repeated, intrigued. Mrs. Barnes hesitated before continuing. "There's a house on the edge of town," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "An old place, the one you're renting. People say it's haunted. That's why no one stays there for long." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Haunted?" She nodded slowly. "Some people say they've seen things. Strange lights, shadows moving in the windows, whispers in the night. It's been that way for as long as anyone can remember. But no one talks about it much. It's unsettling." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. "What happened there? Why is it like that?" Mrs. Barnes looked at me with pity in her eyes. "I don't know all the details, but there are stories about a family who lived there many years ago. Something terrible happened to them. Some say it was a tragedy, others say it was something worse. Either way, the house has been cursed ever since." I didn't want to hear more, but I couldn't help myself. "What kind of tragedy?" She shook her head. "I don't know. Just be careful, stay away from the house at night, and whatever you do, don't go down to the basement." I left the library that day with more questions than answers, my mind racing with possibilities. The house was haunted, or at least, that's what the locals believed. But I wasn't sure if I believed in ghosts. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the tapping was louder than ever. It wasn't just coming from the walls or the ceiling anymore, it was coming from below, from the basement. My heart skipped a beat. I had never ventured down there. I had no reason to, and after what Mrs. Barnes had said, I wasn't sure I wanted to. But the sound of the tapping, rhythmic and insistent, was too much to ignore. I stood at the top of the stairs, my breath shallow, my mind torn. I had to know. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and descended into the darkness. The air was musty, the smell of old wood and damp earth filling my nostrils. The basement was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The flashlight beam danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move as I moved. The tapping was louder now, coming from the far corner of the room. I walked toward it, my pulse quickening with every step. As I reached the corner, I froze. There, in the dark, was a door I hadn't noticed before. It was old, the wood warped and cracked, but it looked like it had been recently opened. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The moment I touched it, the tapping stopped. The air grew still, unnaturally still, as if the house was holding its breath. I opened the door. Behind it was a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with old boxes and dusty furniture. But what caught my eye was the small, faded photograph on the floor, partially hidden beneath a pile of boxes. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I turned it over. It was a picture of a family, 2 parents, a young boy, and a girl. They were standing in front of the house, smiling, but there was something wrong with their eyes. They looked empty, hollow, like they were staring straight through me. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The tapping started again, louder now, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the shadows stretching across the room. I ran. I didn't look back as I hurried up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it. That night, I packed my things. I didn't care about the rent, the house, or the town anymore. I just needed to leave. The tapping, the whispers, the photo, it all told me the same thing. The house wasn't just old, it was haunted. And I wasn't going to stick around to find out what else it was hiding. I left Grayford the next morning, not bothering to say goodbye. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a figure standing in the window of the house, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I never went back to Grayford. Story the end.
Story number 11.
When I first arrived in Glenwood, it felt like the perfect place to escape to. A small town nestled between the hills, surrounded by dense woods and the kind of quiet that felt like it could drown out any noise from the outside world. I'd been living in the city for years, the constant hustle and bustle draining me, and I just needed somewhere calm where I could gather my thoughts and heal. Glenwood was far from the chaos, and it looked like the ideal escape. I found a small house on the edge of town. The realtor mentioned it had been on the market for a while, but the price was right, and it had a charm I couldn't quite explain. It was an old house, built in the 1920s. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, the weight of the past, of history. The house was full of character, wood floors that creaked underfoot, high ceilings that echoed with every movement, and windows that let in streams of soft light during the day. It was cozy, yet there was a strange coldness to it, something I couldn't shake, but I figured it was just because it had been vacant for so long. I'd arrived at the beginning of fall, when the air had that crispness that made you want to curl up with a blanket. The town itself was charming, with its little bakery, local shops, and the old town square. I quickly got acquainted with the neighbors, though they were distant and quiet. Most of them had lived in Glenwood for decades, and while they were polite, there was a sense of detachment, like they were observing me from a distance. I didn't think much of it at first. People from small towns are just like that, I told myself. But things started to feel off almost immediately. The first night I spent in the house, I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound, distant, like a muffled knocking or maybe tapping. It came from downstairs. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The house was old after all, and it made all sorts of noises, but the knocking continued, and it was getting louder. My heart raced as I lay frozen in bed, listening. I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed and check. I crept downstairs, my footsteps cautious on the wooden stairs, which seemed to groan with each step. The knocking was coming from the living room. I slowly pushed the door open, half expecting to find a raccoon or some animal that had gotten inside. But there was nothing. Just the empty room, dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Confused, I turned and made my way back upstairs. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind playing tricks on the old windows. The next day, I ran into one of the neighbors, Mrs. Bartlett. She was an older woman with thin gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. I hadn't had much chance to talk to her, but she seemed to know about everyone in town. "How are you settling in?" she asked, her voice a little too casual, as though she were asking more than just the usual neighborly question. "Good, I think. It's a beautiful town," I replied, trying to keep things light. She smiled, but there was something about it that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It is, yes, but you'll get used to the quiet. Not everyone can. Some people don't last long in Glenwood." I laughed nervously. "I don't mind the quiet. It's actually nice." She studied me for a moment as though weighing my words. Then, as if dismissing the thought, she said, "Well, that's good. You'll need to be strong if you're staying in that house." I froze. The casual way she said it sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice hesitant. She looked around quickly, almost as though checking to see if anyone was listening. "Oh, it's nothing," she said, her tone suddenly light again. "Just old stories. You know how people talk in small towns." But I couldn't shake the look in her eyes. Something was off. That night, I couldn't sleep again. This time, it wasn't just the odd noises, though they had returned, more pronounced and more frequent. This time, I felt a presence, an oppressive heaviness that seemed to settle over the house. It was the kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and suddenly feel like you're being watched, even though no one is there. I was just about to get up to investigate again when I heard something that stopped me cold, a soft voice whispering from the hallway. My name, Lucy. My breath caught in my throat. I held perfectly still, listening, but the voice didn't come again. My heart pounded in my chest, and I wondered if I was losing my mind. I convinced myself that it was just the house. Old houses made noises, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion, the creeping dread hanging over me as the whispers continued. Sometimes they were so faint I thought I'd imagined them. Other times, they were clear, so clear that they seemed to come from just outside my door. The last straw came when I was cleaning out the attic. I had to move some old boxes to make space, and I figured it would be a good way to pass the time. The attic was dark and dusty, the air thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten things. I had just moved an old chest aside when something caught my eye, a small, leather-bound book wedged between two boxes. Curious, I opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the writing faded but still legible. It was a journal, and the entries seemed to be written in a hurried, frantic hand. The first few pages were filled with ordinary details about everyday life, but as I read further, the entries grew more strange, more unsettling. October 12th, 1932. The house is restless tonight. I can hear it whispering, calling my name. I know it's not just the wind, I can feel it. It wants something from me. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. October 14th, 1932. It's worse now. I saw her today, Margaret. She's standing in the hallway, staring at me. I don't know what she wants, but I know she won't leave until I do. October 16th, 1932. I'm leaving. The house is cursed. I don't know how much longer I can stay here before it takes me too. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. Margaret. The name in the journal, the same one Mrs. Bartlett had hinted at, the same one I had seen in the portrait on the wall of the living room. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, or some, was watching me. The whispers had turned into voices, and the voices were growing louder. Lucy, Lucy. They called my name, soft but insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and left the house, even though it was the middle of the night. The street was quiet as I drove through the town, the lights flickering as I passed by. As I reached the outskirts of Glenwood, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, watching me drive away. I never went back. The house on Maple Street still stands, abandoned, its windows dark. The people in Glenwood still talk about it, though they never say much to outsiders. And I still hear whispers sometimes in the back of my mind, calling me back to that house. But I know better than to return. Story the end.
Story number 12.
I never thought I'd end up in a town like Hollow Creek. I had always lived in big cities, places with too much noise, too many people, and too little space. But after a series of personal setbacks, I decided to leave behind the fast-paced life I'd been living and start fresh somewhere quieter. Hollow Creek, with its old cobblestone streets and charming yet worn out cottages, seemed like the perfect place for a new beginning. The town was small, really small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stuck out like a sore thumb. But it wasn't a bad thing. In fact, I liked the idea of blending in, of finding a quiet corner and healing. I rented a small house on the outskirts, far enough from the main street that I could escape into solitude, but close enough to be a part of the community if I ever decided I wanted to be. The house I found was one of those old Victorian-style cottages with peeling paint and a sagging roof, but there was something about it that I couldn't quite explain. It felt right. The real estate agent didn't seem to know much about the property's past. "It's been on the market for a while," she said, glancing at the listing, "but the previous owners left abruptly. No one really talks about why." I didn't press her. Hollow Creek was full of people who preferred to keep their stories to themselves. It was just the way the town worked. I moved in that weekend. The house was smaller than I expected, but it had a certain charm to it. The wooden floors creaked with every step I took. The walls seemed to whisper in the silence. But I was used to that. Old houses had a way of making you feel like they were alive, like they were holding on to something just beneath the surface. I found a small attic space that had been turned into a makeshift bedroom, a cozy place to retreat from the world below. I set up a bed by the window where I could look out over the overgrown yard and the twisted trees that bordered the property. The first few weeks were uneventful. I settled into a routine, unpacked my boxes, and explored the town. The people were friendly enough, though I noticed they were a bit reserved, like they were holding something back. They always spoke in vague terms when I asked about the history of the town, the house, or even the people who used to live there. They'd change the subject quickly, as if they were afraid of something, afraid to speak too much of the past. But it wasn't just the people who seemed strange. The house itself had an energy I couldn't ignore. It was as if the walls had absorbed the lives of everyone who had lived there before me, and now it was my turn to add to its story. It started small, just little things like doors that didn't quite close all the way or the sound of footsteps upstairs when I knew I was the only one in the house. I told myself it was just the house settling, the natural creaks and groans that came with old buildings. But then it started to get worse. One night I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard something that made my blood run cold, a knock at the front door. I froze. It was late, far too late for anyone to be visiting. I slowly got up and peered through the window. There was no one there. The yard was empty, bathed in the moonlight. My heart was pounding as I locked the door, trying to brush off the odd feeling in my chest. Maybe it had just been the wind or a tree branch knocking against the door. I tried to go back to my book, but the unsettling feeling stayed with me. The next few nights, the knocking came again, only this time, it wasn't just at the door. Sometimes it would sound like someone was tapping on the windows, as if trying to get my attention. Other times, I'd hear soft, muffled voices coming from somewhere in the house. I would stand still, straining to hear, but the voices would always stop as soon as I moved. I didn't know what to make of it. It felt too real to be my imagination, but at the same time, I couldn't find any logical explanation. I was alone in the house, and yet I felt like I wasn't. I decided to go to the local library and do some research. Maybe there was something in the town's history that could explain what was happening. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Sutter, had been working there for years, and she was the closest thing to an authority in Hollow Creek. I asked her if she knew anything about the history of the house or if there had been any strange occurrences in the town. Her eyes narrowed when I mentioned the house. She hesitated before speaking, her voice low and cautious. "That house," she said, almost as if she was afraid to say the words. "It's been standing for a long time, longer than most of the buildings in town. There have been incidents, strange things happening there. It's always been that way." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "What kind of incidents?" Mrs. Sutter looked around the library nervously before continuing. "The first owners of the house, the Whitakers, were a quiet family. But people started saying they'd seen strange lights in the windows at night, and there were rumors of odd sounds, footsteps, voices, things like that. Eventually, the Whitakers moved out. Some said they'd been forced out by whatever haunted the place. Others said they just couldn't take it anymore. After them, a couple of other families lived there, but none stayed long. The last family left so quickly that their belongings were still inside when the next tenants arrived. No one talks about it much, but something's always been off about that house. I felt a chill creep down my spine. But why does no one talk about it? Why doesn't anyone leave? Mrs. Sutter shook her head slowly. Some things are better left unspoken. If you value your peace of mind, I'd suggest you move on before it gets worse. Whatever's in that house doesn't take kindly to new tenants. Her words lingered with me long after I left the library. I felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. I didn't want to leave. This place was supposed to be my fresh start, my escape. But the events in the house were growing more disturbing. I couldn't stop the nightmares. Every night I would dream of the same thing, an old woman standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide with terror, reaching out to me as if she wanted something from me. The whispers were getting louder, more urgent. It wasn't just in my head. The tapping at the door became a rhythmic pounding, as though something or someone was trying to break in. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't just leave, not without answers. One night, when the house was unusually quiet, I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I took a flashlight and made my way to the attic, the room where I had been sleeping. I had never gone into the attic before, aside from using it for storage, but that night something compelled me to climb up. As I stepped into the dark attic, the air felt thick, suffocating. The beam from the flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. Then I saw it. There, in the far corner of the room, was a small chest covered in dust and cobwebs. I hadn't noticed it before. My heart pounded as I approached it, my hand shaking as I reached for the lid. The moment I touched it, I felt a rush of cold air, and then the whispers, louder now, frantic. I pulled the chest open. Inside, there was nothing but a collection of old papers, yellowed with age. I sifted through them, but most of it was unintelligible, just scribbles and notes that made no sense. But one piece of paper caught my eye. It was a letter, written in a shaky hand, and it seemed to be addressed to no one in particular. Please, it read, help us, we can't leave. The house won't let us go. It's watching us. It's everywhere. It's in the walls, in the floorboards. It won't stop. We can't escape. My blood ran cold. I suddenly realized that I was not alone in the house. The house itself had been holding on to its past, its secrets, and now it wanted to keep me there too. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I dropped the letter and stumbled backward, knocking over an old chair. In the sudden silence, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above me. I ran. I didn't look back. I packed up what little I had left and left Hollow Creek behind. To this day, I don't know if the town's secrets were true or if I just imagined it all. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers from that old house. Story the end.
Story number 13.
I moved to the town of Oak Ridge in early fall, after hearing the usual fresh start story from a friend who was relocating for work. I didn't expect much from it. It was just a tiny dot on the map, a place that most people pass through on their way to bigger cities. It wasn't the kind of place where things ever seemed to happen, or at least that's how I saw it at first. The first day I arrived, I was struck by how quiet it was. The town had one main street lined with older buildings that had seen better days. There were a few shops, an old diner, and a library, which seemed to be the heart of the place. But as I settled in, something started to feel off. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of history, not the good kind, but the kind that sits heavy on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I rented a small house on the outskirts of town. It was an old cottage, weathered by years of storms and sun. The landlord, a middle-aged man named Mr. Hanley, was an odd figure, friendly but distant, his eyes always lingering just a moment too long on anything you said. Still, I didn't think much of it. I had lived in odd places before. The first night I spent in Oak Ridge, I sat in the living room, unpacking and getting used to the quiet. There wasn't much noise, no honking horns, no chatter from the streets. It was a stillness that felt almost unnatural. The wind picked up around midnight, whistling through the cracks in the old house's windows. It wasn't so much a normal breeze, but a sharp gust that seemed to make the house creak in protest. I brushed it off as just another quirk of the place. The following day, I went to the local diner, which was the closest thing the town had to a social hub. The regulars sat at the counter, sipping coffee and talking in low voices, but the conversation dropped to a hush as I walked in. Everyone stopped for a moment, eyeing me, and then resumed their quiet murmurs, but with a distinct wariness now in their gaze. The waitress, a woman named Maggie, gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She brought me a menu, and I ordered a cup of coffee, trying to ignore the odd feeling in the air. As she refilled my cup, I asked her about the town. She smiled again, but this time it seemed forced. It's a quiet place, Oak Ridge. Not much happens here. People like it that way. A lot of folks came here to escape things. Her voice trailed off, and she quickly moved away before I could ask her to elaborate. The town's strange aura started to creep into my thoughts more frequently. It wasn't just the way people looked at me, but how they always seemed to avoid eye contact, as if they were hiding something. I didn't let it bother me, though. I was used to small-town life, and I figured I just wasn't used to their way of doing things yet. Still, that night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around 2 weeks after I moved in, things began to take a strange turn. I had gotten into the habit of walking through the woods behind my house, an old, dense forest that was eerily quiet. I wasn't much of a nature person, but there was something strangely magnetic about the place. It was the kind of forest where the trees grew close together, their branches intertwining above to block out most of the sunlight. It felt like walking through a tunnel, and yet there was something comforting about it, until the day it wasn't. I was deep in the woods, further than I had gone before, when I came across an old stone foundation. It was almost hidden by thick vines and overgrowth, but the stones were clearly old, too old to have been built recently. As I stepped closer, I noticed strange carvings on the stones, like symbols I didn't recognize. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, almost as if they were alive. I felt a coldness seep into my bones, an unsettling chill that made me want to turn around and run. Something about the place seemed wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a sudden, sharp gust of wind made the trees groan ominously. I left the area quickly, not looking back, and when I returned home, I tried to push the strange feeling from my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was still howling through the trees, and it felt as if the house itself was alive, groaning and shifting with each gust. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence in the room with me, something watching, waiting. I didn't want to admit it, but the thought of something being in the house with me terrified me. The following night, I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, but it grew louder, a slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor above me. I froze, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. The house was old, but the only other person who had lived there before me was Mr. Hanley, and he had told me he hadn't heard any noises. I tried to convince myself it was the house settling, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to take a walk through the town to clear my head. I passed by the library and decided to stop in, hoping to find something to explain what was happening to me. The library had a dark, old feel to it, with wooden shelves stacked high with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The librarian, an elderly woman with a stern face, eyed me as I entered, but didn't say anything. I wandered through the aisles, looking for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. I stumbled upon a dusty old book on local folklore and ghost stories, and as I flipped through it, one particular story caught my eye. It was about a house in Oak Ridge, not far from where I lived. The story described how the house had been built on the land where several executions had taken place during the town's early days. The condemned souls, the book said, were trapped, and their spirits lingered, haunting the area. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I read. The story mentioned the very house I was living in, how the land had once been cursed, and how no one who had lived there had ever stayed long enough to tell the tale. My heart raced, and I quickly put the book down. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, I sat in the living room, trying to push away the feeling of dread that had settled over me. But the noises started again. This time, the dragging sound was joined by faint whispers, soft, unintelligible voices coming from the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of despair, of people trapped in an eternal state of suffering. I rushed out of the house, unable to bear it any longer. The night air hit me like a slap to the face, but it did little to calm my nerves. I walked down the street, not knowing where I was going, just needing to escape. That's when I saw him, Mr. Hanley, standing in front of my house, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. He was staring at the window, and it seemed as though he was waiting for something. When he noticed me, he quickly turned and started walking away, but I caught up with him. I asked him what he was doing, and he stopped, his face darkening. "You need to leave," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have come here." Before I could ask him why, he turned and walked back toward his own home without another word. The next morning, I packed my things and left Oak Ridge without looking back. I never spoke to Mr. Hanley again, and I've never returned to the town. But the experience has stayed with me, lingering in my mind like the shadows in that house. I still hear the whispers sometimes, and I still feel the presence, like something is watching me, waiting for me to return. Story the end.
Story number 14.
I had always wanted to live in a small, quiet town. After years of the rush and chaos of city life, I was craving something different, something peaceful. When I found a job offer in the small town of Iron Ridge, I couldn't pass it up. It wasn't the best paying job, but it was enough for me to live comfortably, and it offered a fresh start. I had never heard of Iron Ridge before, but the idea of a town that wasn't overcrowded and hectic was enticing. I decided to take the plunge and moved there in early 2023. Iron Ridge was a town that felt frozen in time. It had its own charm. Cobblestone streets lined with old Victorian houses, small local shops, and a general sense of calm. The town was surrounded by thick forests and winding dirt roads, adding to the isolated feel. As soon as I arrived, I rented a small 2-story house on the outskirts of town. The place was cheap, which was an immediate red flag, but I didn't think much of it. I was so eager to escape the city that I overlooked a lot of the signs. The house itself was old, a dilapidated structure with peeling paint and cracked windows. It wasn't the kind of place I would have ever considered back in the city, but it had character. It had a large front porch, a small backyard that bordered a dense patch of trees, and a high fence that blocked most of the view of the street. The house seemed to sit in a perpetual state of decay, but I thought it gave the place some personality. There was something about the house that drew me in, as though it were meant to be mine. My first few days in the house were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, exploring the small town, and trying to get acclimated. Iron Ridge had a population of only around 3,000, and the people there were friendly enough, though there was an odd sense of wariness about them. They weren't unfriendly, but there was a certain hesitation whenever they spoke to me, as if they were unsure of who I was or what I was doing there. I figured it was just the small town mentality. Outsiders weren't exactly common in a place like Iron Ridge. It didn't take long for me to feel the strange presence in the house, though. It was subtle at first. A cold spot in the hallway. A door that would creak open when I was certain I had shut it tight. Little things that seemed out of place but were easy to dismiss. I convinced myself that it was just the house settling, as old houses often do. But after a few weeks, I started to hear things, sounds that I couldn't explain. It was late one night when I first heard the footsteps. I had just finished a long day of work and was sitting in the living room watching a movie when I heard someone walking upstairs. The floorboards creaked with every step, heavy footsteps moving slowly across the second floor. My heart skipped a beat, but I brushed it off as the house making noises again. But as the footsteps continued, I realized I hadn't heard any doors open or close, and I was the only one in the house. I stood up, my stomach twisting with unease. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way upstairs, every step feeling heavier than the last. The second floor was dark, save for a faint light from the moon that filtered through the cracks in the blinds. I walked down the hallway, past the 2 bedrooms, and into the bathroom. The door to the master bedroom was cracked open. I could see a shadow moving inside. I froze. The shadow seemed to shift as though someone was walking around inside the room. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way anyone else was in the house. I had locked all the doors and windows before settling in for the night. I slowly pushed open the bedroom door, the old hinges groaning under my touch. The room was empty. The bed was undisturbed, and the air felt cold, unnaturally so. I glanced around, my heart racing, and noticed something strange on the floor near the window, a dark stain that hadn't been there before. It looked like water, but it was too dark to be just water. I knelt down, inspecting it, but before I could get a closer look, the door behind me slammed shut. I jumped back, panic rising in my chest. I turned, but there was no one in the hallway, no sign of anyone around. I ran to the door, pulling it open as fast as I could, but the hallway was completely silent. The house felt different now, colder, like the warmth had been sucked out of it. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain it. The next few days were more of the same. The footsteps returned, always at night. I would hear them pacing back and forth upstairs, growing louder and more frantic. Sometimes I would hear soft whispers, just out of reach, like someone was speaking in the next room. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I had heard the sounds too clearly to dismiss them as just the house settling. Something was in the house with me, something that didn't want me there. I decided to reach out to some of the locals. I had heard vague rumors about the house before, but no one was willing to speak openly about it. But one day, I bumped into an older man named Gerald outside the general store. He had lived in Iron Ridge for most of his life and knew the town's history better than anyone. "Are you living in that old house on Elm Street?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly when I nodded. I hesitated before answering. "Yeah, I moved in a couple of weeks ago." "Why?" Gerald glanced around before lowering his voice. "You shouldn't be living there," he said bluntly. "That house has a history, a bad one. You should have been told about it before you moved in." "What do you mean?" I asked. My curiosity piqued. Gerald sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "It used to belong to the Delacroix family. They were well known in these parts, had money, had a good name. But they disappeared, just up and left one day, and no one ever saw them again. People say it was because of, well, things that happened in the house." "What kind of things?" He glanced over his shoulder again, making sure no one was listening. "People say the house is cursed, that it's haunted by something that doesn't want people living there. No one really knows for sure what happened, but there's been more than one family that's tried to live in that place. They all leave eventually, usually after seeing something they shouldn't. The Delacroix, they were never found. Some folks think they're still there, trapped." The words hung in the air, heavy with an unsettling finality. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it just a ghost story, a town legend meant to scare newcomers? Or was there something more to it? I didn't have the answers, but what Gerald said made sense of everything that had been happening. I didn't sleep much that night. The sounds in the house were worse than ever. The footsteps weren't just walking anymore. They were running, frantically pacing from one end of the hallway to the other. I could hear breathing now, low and raspy, like someone was standing right behind me, just out of sight. I tried to leave the house the next day, but every time I stepped outside, I felt a compulsion to return. It was like the house was calling to me, pulling me back in. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as if I was becoming part of it, as if it had somehow claimed me. The next night, I gathered my courage and went upstairs again. This time, I wasn't going to turn back. I had to know what was going on in that room. I opened the door to the master bedroom, and the room felt colder than before. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor, and the air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't identify. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, a figure stood in the corner. A woman, tall and thin, her face obscured by dark hair. She was standing motionless, her head slightly tilted to the side as though she was waiting for me to notice her. I froze, unable to move, unable to look away. The whispers started again, this time clear and unmistakable. "Leave. Now." I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The house seemed to loom behind me, dark and threatening, as though it was angry that I had left. I never went back to the house after that night. I packed up everything I could carry and left Iron Ridge. To this day, I don't know what happened to the house or to the Delacroix family. I don't know if what I saw was real or if it was just my mind breaking under the pressure of the isolation. But I do know one thing. I never want to go back. Story the end.